Hey everyone!
Tonight we're drifting back to the North Sea. The waves are black and heavy, the stars above are sharp as frost, and the sound you hear is the slow creak of a long ship cutting through ice-laced waters. Pause. The men aboard are shivering. Their cloaks are damp, their beards are crusted with salt, and someone, inevitably, has frostbite somewhere unpleasant. And yet, for all the cold, there's no fire.
No roaring hearth.
No flicker of warmth beneath a sail. Just breath, wool and hope. So how did the Vikings, those famously practical, occasionally murderous, and always freezing people, keep themselves warm while sailing across the kind of sea that would kill most of us in 10 minutes? That's what we're exploring tonight. So settle in. Pull your blanket a little closer.
And let's drift back to the Viking Age,
where warmth was a luxury and central heating meant being crammed next to 12 other people who hadn't bathed in a month. If you were a Viking, setting sail around the year 900, you'd be living in what historians like to call a challenging climate, which is academic for it was cold enough to make your soul hurt. The North Atlantic could freeze solid in places. The wind would cut through you like you'd personally offended it.
and your long ship, beautiful though it was, offered no protection at all. It was essentially a big wooden canoe with dragon decorations.
No deck, no cabin, and absolutely no place to light a fire. The Vikings, being Vikings, of course, tried anyway. They experimented with small fires in iron pots called heating pans. These were suspended over stones or set into sand at the ship's bottom. And yes, occasionally this worked. More often it didn't, because naturally fire and wood and fabric sails make terrible companions. A few too many embers, and suddenly your journey to plunder Ireland became a journey to the bottom of the sea. So instead, the Vikings turned to the human body's most reliable furnace, itself. The trick, they discovered, was layers. Wool, linen, animal hides, anything that trapped air and held moisture away from skin. A well-dressed Viking sailor looked less like a warrior and more like a particularly resentful onion. They'd wear thick woolen tunics, trousers bound tight at the calves, fur-lined boots, and cloaks fastened with bronze or iron brooches. Their ships carried cloaks made of sheepskin, sometimes even lined with fleece turned inward. The wealthy might wear reindeer hide or seal fur if they'd recently murdered a seal for it, which was likely. But the real warmth came not from fur or wool, but from proximity. A crew of 30 or 40 men, packed shoulder to shoulder beneath a sail, all exhaling warm air into the cramped space. That was insulation.
That was life-saving.
And it explains why Viking crews were known to sleep so close that they practically fused into one snoring collective organism. It wasn't pleasant, it was just necessary. Some ships even had low, tent-like coverings stretched over the midsection, called tilts or awnings. They were made from sailcloth, oiled leather or woolen tarpaulins tied down with ropes. These offered just enough protection from the rain and wind to keep the crew alive. The air beneath would grow thick, wet and rancid, but at least it was warm. Inside these makeshift tents, they'd huddle, sharing the heat from small oil lamps called lysi. These lamps burned seal or whale oil in shallow iron or clay bowls, giving off a faint yellow light and an even fainter warmth. They smelled terrible, like burning fish, but they were the closest thing to a fireplace the Vikings could manage without dying in a blaze of irony. Of course, before and after the voyage, Vikings preferred warmth in a more civilized form. The Longhouses, the Longhouse. These long wooden halls were miracle machines of prehistoric insulation. Thick turf walls, thatched roofs,
Central hearths that burned all day.
inside, heat rose and smoke drifted lazily through a vent in the roof, coating every rafter in soot. The floor was layered with rushes and animal skins, and benches ran along the walls for sleeping. It wasn't comfortable exactly. It was smoky, dark, and constantly damp. But compared to an open deck in the North Sea, it was paradise. And it was from these warm, communal halls that sailors set out reluctantly.
Into the frozen waves. The curious thing about the Vikings is how normal the cold was to them.
They didn't write about it much. They barely complained, at least not in surviving sagas. To them, the cold wasn't an enemy, it was just.
There, like the sea.
Or the constant threat of dying violently. They had words for snow, frost, and ice, dozens of them, but they saved their real poetic energy for describing wind. Winds could bring good fortune or death. They were named, cursed, prayed to. Cold was just the background noise of existence. That stoicism probably explains why Viking-era Scandinavians rarely built ships with enclosed cabins, even for long voyages. Some later versions, like the Thaw, a wider cargo ship, had small shelters or removable huts, but they were the exception, not the rule. Most Viking sailors slept directly on their gear, coils of rope, animal hides, or their own shields, and relied on their cloaks and body heat to keep them alive. And they did survive. We know this because, inconveniently for everyone else, they kept showing up. On English coasts, in Irish monasteries, in French river towns, still alive, still cold, and still somehow not frozen to death. They even reached Greenland and North America, sailing through icy fog with nothing but wool and determination. When they made landfall, they built turf houses again, half buried, sealed tight, and heated with simple hearth fires. They adapted. Because, if the sagas tell us anything, Vikings were nothing if not stubborn. The question of warmth wasn't just physical, it was cultural. A good Viking man, according to their sagas, was expected to endure discomfort. Complaining was undignified.
Freezing stoically was a sign of strength.
There's an old Norse word, kulda, meaning coldness, not only in temperature, but in temperament. A man who could face the cold with calm was a man of worth, so they didn't whine. They wrapped themselves in animal skins, clenched their teeth, and rode through sleet, because that's what a proper Viking did. It's almost poetic, in a bleak, hypothermic kind of way. When they weren't sailing, the Vikings developed other ways to cheat the cold. They made heated stones, small, flat rocks warmed in a fire, wrapped in cloth, and tucked inside cloaks or beneath bedding. They filled leather pouches with hot water or animal fat to create primitive hot water bottles, and naturally they drank
Mead, ale, or anything else that numbed the sensation of being slowly turned into an icicle. But on the ship, even alcohol had its limits.
too much mead, and you'd fall overboard, which would end the warmth problem permanently. So most of the time, they simply endured. They rode until their muscles burned, ate cold, dried fish, and counted down the days until they saw land again. Modern reconstructions of Viking voyages, done by brave, possibly unwise enthusiasts, have shown that it's almost impossible to stay dry on a longship. Sea spray seeps through everything. Even the best wool soaks eventually, and the temperature drops fast once the wind hits it. Researchers who've tried to replicate these journeys often describe the cold as numbing, total, and spiritually disorienting. One even said, "You stop thinking about warmth, you just become part of the ship." which sounds poetic but also deeply unpleasant. The Vikings had a word for that kind of merging: seder, a magical connection between humans and nature. Maybe, in a way, enduring the cold wasn't just survival, it was spiritual. A test of will and faith and stubbornness. Let's drift, for a moment, to a particular scene. The year is roughly 985. You're on a Gnar, heading west from Iceland toward the edge of the known world. The sea is grey as slate. Snow flurries drift across the deck. The sail above you cracks like thunder in the wind. You're wrapped in a reindeer skin cloak, sitting beside a chest filled with dried fish, your hands numb and aching. You can see your crewmate's breath in the dim, pale light. Someone hums a low song, something about Odin, or home, or both. And beneath you, the ship's timbers groan like a living thing. It's miserable, but it's also strangely peaceful. This is what the Vikings lived for: the test, the endurance, the quiet, endless movement of the sea. And as long as they could feel their fingers, and sometimes even when they couldn't, they kept going. Now, there's a charming myth that the Vikings used stones heated by volcanic activity to warm their ships. Sadly, there's no real evidence for that. Volcanic regions like Iceland certainly offered warmth from the earth, but carrying lava rocks onto a wooden ship wasn't exactly advisable. It's the kind of story medieval chroniclers loved, because it made the Vikings sound like frost-proof supermen. In reality, they were just cold men in wet clothes trying not to die. And yet they succeeded often enough that the myth persisted. There's something quietly admirable about it, really. They didn't invent insulation or stoves or fancy wool-lined boots with moisture barriers. They just used what they had, endured what they couldn't change, and made it work.
It's not glamorous. It's not even comfortable. But it's very
Viking, because in their world, survival itself was a kind of triumph. So the answer to our question, how did the Vikings heat their ships on icy seas without fire, is simple. They didn't. They outlasted the cold instead. They turned themselves into human furnaces through motion, companionship, and sheer defiance of nature. They wore wool, huddled close, and learned to treat frostbite as just another minor inconvenience. And when they finally reached shore, they built fire that smoked up to the rafters, drank until their bones thawed, and told sagas about their journeys, not to boast of comfort, but to celebrate endurance. That, in the end, was their warmth. Let's drift onward now through another curious detail of Viking life. Something less about the cold and more about the comfort they sought when they finally stepped back on land. Because if there was one thing a Viking valued more than a good sword, it was a warm bed and a story told by firelight.
And those fires had their own secrets.
Hey everyone!
Still here? Still awake?
If you are, that's fine. Tonight we're leaving the frozen deck behind and stepping inside. The sea wind fades. The boards stop creaking. You can almost smell it. Smoke, wet wool, a hint of mead, and something vaguely burning that might have once been food. We're in a Viking longhouse now, warm, dim, and alive. This was home. And for all the sagas about blood feuds and raids and gods demanding sacrifices, the heart of Viking life was much simpler. It was the fire. Not a grand hearth of marble, not an ornate fireplace with carved mantles. Just a long, shallow pit in the middle of the floor, lined with stones and filled with smouldering wood. It smoked constantly. It stung the eyes. But it kept you alive. A Viking longhouse was a masterpiece of primitive engineering. Usually around 20 to 30 meters long, it was built from timber or turf, whatever material the land allowed. Thick outer walls insulated with straw or moss, curved slightly inward, making the whole thing feel like a wooden ship turned upside down. And in a sense, that's exactly what it was, a shelter designed to float through the long winters instead of the sea. Along the center ran the hearth, the only source of heat and light. Above it, a smoke hole or luri cut through the roof.
In theory, this let the smoke escape.
In practice, it mostly let in cold air, snow, and occasional bits of bird.
If you stood directly under the hole, you froze.
You stood too far from it, you choked. So everyone learned to live in the smoky middle ground, eyes watering, but warm enough to forget they were inhaling half a tree's worth of soot each winter. The fire wasn't just for heat, it was the center of life.
Meals were cooked there, tools were forged, stories were told, and arguments were settled, sometimes loudly, sometimes with axes.
But mostly it was calm. Vikings prized stillness when the day was done. They'd sit around the fire on benches or animal hides, sharing stew and ale, listening to a skald, a storyteller, recount the old myths. Those myths, if you've ever read them, are violent, tragic, and sometimes absurd. But around the fire, softened by the flickering glow, they became lullabies of identity. The stories of Thaw and Odin and Freya weren't bedtime tales for children. They were reminders of who they were supposed to be. Brave, cunning, and uncomplaining, even when everything hurt.
And everything usually did.
The fuel of choice was birch or pine, depending on where you lived. In Iceland, where trees were scarce, people burned driftwood, dung, or peat, each producing a smell that was memorable. Peat, for example, filled the air with a thick, earthy musk that clung to everything, clothes, hair, even dreams. But it kept the house warm. Some Viking families kept small, flat stones near the edge of the fire. They'd heat them, wrap them in cloth, and place them under blankets before sleeping. Primitive bed warmers. Others used oil lamps, shallow bowls filled with fish or seal oil, their wicks made from twisted moss or sheep's wool. They glowed faintly, the light golden and uneven, throwing long shadows across the beams. There's a word in Old Norse, elder, meaning both fire and life. The two were interchangeable. If the fire went out, the household spirit, called Veta, was believed to leave too. So the flame was never allowed to die completely. Even at night, someone would rise to stir the embers, feed them, whisper to them, because to sleep with a dead fire was to invite misfortune.
It's interesting, isn't it?
We tend to imagine the Vikings as these relentless warriors, loud, brutal, unstoppable. But the reality inside the Longhouse was very different. It was quiet, dim, soft in its own way. Children would curl up near the walls, wrapped in blankets made from wool or reindeer hide. Dogs lay beside the hearth, twitching in their sleep. The older men, often half-deaf from years of battle, dozed upright with their cloaks pulled over their heads, and in the background the fire whispered, a steady, living breath. It's easy to see why so many Norse rituals revolved around flame. They burned offerings to their gods, not just to send them smoke, but warmth, the one thing the divine surely lacked in those endless northern skies. When guests arrived, merchants, travelers, maybe a rival chieftain, they were greeted not with ceremony, but with heat. A place by the fire was the ultimate gesture of hospitality. It meant safety. It meant food, shelter, and acceptance. The Norse sagas are full of these moments. In Havamal, the sayings of the High One, there's an old verse. Fire is needful to the newcomer, whose knees are frozen numb. food and clothing the wanderer craves, who has fared o'er the rimy fell. That's not poetry, it's survival advice. The Viking world was harsh enough that kindness had to be practical. If you turned away a freezing traveler, you might be condemning yourself later when the roles reversed. So they kept the fire burning, not just for themselves, but for whoever might need it next. Still, for all their pragmatism, the Vikings had strange ideas about fire's personality. They believed it could listen, it could grow angry, it could remember. The Vetter, those household spirits, were thought to dwell in the hearth's stones or beneath the floor nearby. Families made small offerings to them, bits of bread, butter, or ale, poured quietly into the flames. In return, the spirit would keep the fire steady, the home safe, and the smoke hole clear. If neglected, the flame might sputter, smoke would fill the hall, and misfortune would follow. Fire was a friend, but one you had to treat well. A guest, not at all. There's something deeply human about that.
Even today, we stare into fire the same way they did, watching the patterns shift, losing track of time.
It's hypnotic. Maybe it's the same ancient comfort they felt after days of frost and fear, sitting down, thawing out, watching something glow.
It's the closest thing to peace their world could offer.
Of course, not every longhouse was equal. A chieftain's hall could be enormous, lined with carved beams, polished shields, tapestries, and benches long enough to seat 100 men. There'd be feasting, singing, laughter echoing off the rafters. The fire pit in such a hall could stretch 10 meters, flames licking high into the smoky air. Servants would carry in whole roasted animals, while skalds recited poems about the host's ancestors, most of them probably exaggerated. But beneath the grandeur, it was the same principle. Warmth equals power. To control fire was to command comfort, to show abundance in a land where heat itself was a luxury. A poor man's fire was small and desperate. A king's fire was vast and constant. It's no wonder they imagined their gods feasting around eternal flames. The fire also had one other less glorious use: smoke preservation. Hanging from the rafters above the hearth were strips of meat and fish, slowly cured in the constant haze. The smell must have been intense. Smoke, salt, sweat, and stew, an entire symphony of scent. It clung to every person who lived there, so thoroughly that travelers from southern Europe once wrote that Scandinavians smelled of smoke even in their dreams. They weren't wrong. Night in a longhouse was a strange balance between life and death.
Outside, the world froze.
Inside, embers glowed. The fire dimmed, but it never went out. Someone always stirred, perhaps a mother tending to a child, or a man dreaming of a raid, rising half awake to poke the coals. He'd see the faint orange light on the walls, the smoke curling upward like spirits, and then lie back down again, the warmth returning through layers of wool and fatigue. It's not hard to imagine that moment, quiet, rhythmic, and utterly timeless. The same motion repeated for centuries: breathe, stir, sleep, endure. In that repetition there's a lesson. The Vikings are remembered for their violence, but their true genius was endurance. They learned to survive the cold, not through innovation, but patience. Their longships conquered the sea, but their longhouses conquered the dark. And when morning came, grey, cold, and damp, they would rake the embers, feed the fire again, and start another day.
Always tending, always enduring.
Because warmth wasn't guaranteed. It had to be earned, protected, and kept alive by hand. There's a quiet irony in that, isn't there? The people who terrified half of Europe spent most of their time just trying to stay warm. The fierce, axe-wielding warriors of legend were also, quite literally, huddled under blankets, complaining softly about drafts. But maybe that's what makes them fascinating. Not their raids or conquests, but their humanity, their tiny comforts, their smoky fires, their stubborn need to create a pocket of warmth in a frozen world. In the end, that might be the most Viking thing of all. Let's drift now just a little further into the smaller details, the domestic rituals, the quiet chores, the ways they kept the cold from creeping in. Because beyond fire and fur, there was a whole culture of warmth, built from nothing but habit, ingenuity, and stubbornness.
Hey everyone. Still here? Still awake?
If you are, that's perfectly fine. We're still in the north. The storm is still outside.
And inside this dim, smoky hall, the world is almost still.
You can hear the faint crackle of the hearth. Someone shifts beneath a fur blanket. A dog sighs. The long night stretches on. And this is where we'll stay for a while, inside the Viking home. Not the ships, not the raids, not the sagas carved into stone. Just this quiet, enclosed world where warmth was both a necessity and an art form. Because, believe it or not, surviving the Scandinavian winter wasn't just about courage, it was about routine. Let's start with the walls. They were thick, often a meter thick, made of overlapping logs or turf blocks cut from the frozen ground. Turf was astonishingly efficient. It trapped heat, repelled wind, and smelled faintly like the earth itself. When snow piled against it in winter, it became even better insulated, turning the longhouse into something halfway between a dwelling and a burrow. Most of these houses had few, if any, windows. Glass was rare. Instead, animal bladders, usually from cattle or pigs, were stretched thin and fastened across small openings. They let in a weak, milky light but kept the cold at bay. A window of sorts, yes, but a window that looked permanently fogged, as though the world outside was just a dream.
Inside, warmth depended on proximity.
The central hearth gave off heat, but not enough to reach the far corners of the hall. So the family gathered close, sleeping, eating, working within the same few square meters. The outer edges of the house were used for storage, tools, salted meat, and occasionally the livestock itself. Yes, in winter the animals came inside, cows, sheep, goats, all sharing the same air, the same smoke. It was loud, it was messy, and the smell could reportedly knock a Norseman flat, but it kept everyone warm. Every creature in the longhouse, human or otherwise, was part of the heating system. Viking beds were simple. Wooden frames raised slightly from the floor to avoid the damp, with woven straw mats laid on top. Over that came blankets, cloaks and furs, often reindeer or bear if you were lucky. For the poorer families, it might just be sheepskin and rough wool. There were no pillows as we'd know them. Instead, they used bags of straw or bundled clothing. Comfort wasn't the goal, retaining warmth was. And so people slept fully dressed, cloaks pulled tight, sometimes even wearing their boots.
Families shared beds too.
Parents, children, servants, it wasn't considered improper. It was simply practical. Body heat mattered more than privacy. And in a land where the night could last 18 hours, closeness meant survival. There's a kind of poetry to how they organized their days. When winter came, everything slowed. The sea froze, the farms went silent, and the people turned inward, both physically and spiritually. The sagas call this time Vetra Seta, the winter sitting. It wasn't laziness. It was life lived on pause. The outside world became unreachable, so the inner world grew louder. People repaired tools, mended clothing, recited stories, carved runes into bits of wood. They talked, sang softly, and waited for the sun to return. It's strangely peaceful to imagine an entire civilization accepting the rhythm of the cold, not fighting it, just existing within it. Clothing was naturally an obsession. Vikings didn't have fashion seasons, they had survival layers. The undergarments were linen if you were rich, rough wool if you weren't. Over that came tunics, trousers, leg bindings, cloaks and mittens. A favorite trick was to felt walk their wool, essentially shrinking and thickening it with heat and moisture, making it windproof. Shoes were made from soft leather, often stuffed with straw for insulation. Socks, when they existed, were knitted from wool or fashioned from woven cloth wrapped around the foot. There's a wonderful archaeological find from York, modern England, but once Viking Jorvik, where fragments of socks were discovered, still showing their stitching. Thick, clumsy and functional, exactly as you'd expect.
And in typical Viking fashion, when something wore out, it wasn't thrown away.
It became something else. A cloak became a blanket. A blanket became a rag.
A rag became stuffing for a shoe.
Nothing was wasted, not when every scrap of warmth counted. As for food, that was its own form of heat. The Viking diet in winter was heavy and rich. Stews thickened with barley, salted fish boiled with onions, dried meat softened in broth. They needed the calories just to stay warm, the human furnace running full time. Meals were cooked over the central hearth, in iron cauldrons that hung from chains. The smoke flavored everything, whether you wanted it to or not. The taste of the Viking world was equal parts salt, soot, and determination. To modern eyes, the longhouse might seem unbearable, dark, smoky, cramped. But to them it was the definition of comfort. It was where warmth lived, where stories were born, and where the outside world, hostile, endless, and cold, could be kept at a polite distance. They even had a word for that feeling of safety, Heimer. It meant home, but also world. To be home wasn't just to be indoors, it was to be alive within a small circle of heat and light, while winter roared outside. When night came fully, the rituals of warmth took on a rhythm. The fire was banked with ashes to keep it glowing through the dark. Children were tucked beneath cloaks. Dogs shifted near the door, both guardians and living insulation, and the wind pressed against the turf walls like an ancient creature trying to get in. The Norse had a phrase for those long, sealed nights, vetranot, winter night. It meant not just the passage of time, but the feeling of being suspended between life and death.
Outside was the frozen void. Inside was the flicker of survival.
And in that flicker, they found meaning. There's something quietly beautiful about their resilience. They didn't conquer the cold, they learned to live beside it.
Every ritual, every object, every layer of wool existed for one purpose, to make endurance feel almost sacred. Even the smallest comforts became precious.
A mug of hot ale, a new pair of wool mittens, the moment a spark caught in the morning and the fire came back to life. Tiny, fleeting victories against the endless chill. We rarely think of warmth as a spiritual act, but to the Vikings it was. To feed the fire was to honor life itself. Interestingly, warmth also shaped their social life. The fire pit wasn't just physical, it was political. Who sat closest to it mattered. In a chieftain's hall, proximity to heat and light signaled status. The leader sat near the center, his guests beside him. The servants and slaves, the thralls, kept to the edges, half in shadow. Even in comfort, hierarchy ruled. Warmth, like everything else, was distributed by power. But during storms, when the wind howled and the snow buried the door, those divisions blurred. Everyone, chieftain, wife, servant, animal, was the same kind of creature, breathing the same smoky air, waiting for dawn. There's a line from an Icelandic saga that says, "Man is warmth against the cold of the world." It's a simple sentence, but it captures the whole Viking spirit. They lived in a world that offered nothing freely, no mercy, no comfort, no warmth.
And yet they built all three for themselves. A house, a hearth, a habit of care.
In that sense, the Vikings were not so much conquerors as caretakers of fire, of home, of each other. Let's drift for a moment back outside. The longhouse stands against the snow. From the roof, thin smoke rises into a pale, starless sky. Inside, 30 souls sleep together, breathing softly, wrapped in furs. The fire glows faintly beneath its cover of ash, waiting for morning. And you can almost feel it, the quiet pulse of heat beneath the cold earth. A heartbeat of survival, steady and small. That was the Viking secret. No magic, no miracle, just endurance. Stacked, layer upon layer, until spring returned. When the first light came, weak, grey, and reluctant, they'd rise, shake the frost from the doorway, stir the fire back to life, and step out into the world again, where everything gleamed under ice and silence. Their breath misted in the air, but they were alive. And in a land like that, being alive was enough. So the art of staying warm in the Viking world wasn't just about heating, it was about persistence, an unspoken pact between people, fire, and earth, each keeping the others alive. Every ember mattered, every blanket told a story.
Every shared bed, every smoked meal, every rough wool cloak, all tiny victories against extinction.
And somehow through all that, they didn't just survive. They built a world defined not by its battles, but by the quiet, smoky glow that kept them human. Let's drift onward next time, further into the Viking night, because warmth wasn't their only comfort. They also had rituals, dreams, and strange beliefs to guide them through the dark.
And those
were even warmer than fire. Hey everyone.
Still here? Still awake?
If you are, that's fine. Let's drift back to the dark water again. Picture the sea around midnight. A winter voyage, the wind chewing at the edges of your fur cloak. The world around you isn't black, it's deep blue with glints of ice. Somewhere behind the sail, there's the quiet clatter of oars being drawn in. You can almost hear the wood creak, like an old voice complaining about age. The Vikings didn't have much light out there, but they didn't need it. Fire was a risk, lanterns were dim, and candles were precious. So they relied on glow. Not metaphorical glow, actual glow. There are medieval accounts of sea lights, faint bioluminescence flickering under the hull. It came from disturbed plankton stirred by the oars. The men sometimes called it Aegir's laughter, after the sea god who loved to mock mortals who dared his domain. When the oars went in, little beads of blue-green light rippled along the surface. It must have felt supernatural, the ocean quietly laughing in light beneath your boat. This glow gave them something to look at, and it helped them steer in the dark at least a little. But the real light came from above, the stars. The Vikings knew them intimately, better than most people today know their own neighborhoods. They had names for them, songs for them, even quiet jokes about them. The North Star was their anchor, the one point that never moved. But for men who spent months on the water, even the stars had moods. Cloud cover meant disorientation, and disorientation meant death, so they learned to feel direction. Not just know it, feel it. They used a tool called the Sunstone. The Icelandic sagas mention it, and it was rediscovered centuries later, a crystal of Icelandic spar, a natural form of calcite. You could hold it up to the sky, even through fog, and it polarized light, showing where the sun was hidden.
Magic for all practical purposes. A navigator could tilt the stone and watch light split. One side brightened, the direction of the sun.
With that, he could recalibrate his course even under heavy cloud. Not bad for men who never had a compass. Of course, none of this helped much with the cold. At night, on open water, the temperature could sink below freezing, and the sea spray that landed on your cloak didn't dry, it crusted, salt and ice combining to make a stiff shell over your shoulders. Some men would take turns standing, stamping their feet to keep blood moving. Others tucked under animal hides and huddled together, breathing in short clouds that hung like ghosts over the deck. One saga mentions that they sometimes slept in their cloaks with one hand still gripping a shield, so that if the sea took him he would not fall alone. There's a grim kind of poetry in that. Now,
you might be wondering how they ate anything that wasn't frozen.
The answer again lies in preparation. They carried dried fish, hard as leather but full of salt. They'd soak it in seawater before eating. They brought dried meat, butter stored in animal bladders, and occasionally beer or mead sealed in small casks. The alcohol didn't freeze, which was helpful. if you didn't mind drinking something that occasionally tasted like mouldy rope. Still, they managed.
Always managed, and the ships, they were miracles of cold endurance.
Long ships were built with a technique called clinker planking, overlapping boards fastened by iron rivets. This gave them flexibility. The hull could bend slightly with each wave, flexing instead of breaking. The overlapping seams were sealed with tar and wool, sometimes even mixed with animal hair or moss to improve insulation. One curious thing, on colder voyages, they sometimes stuffed seaweed between the planks on the inside. It worked as a natural dampener, keeping out some drafts and absorbing stray moisture. Imagine a ship smelling of brine, tar, and kelp, a moving slice of the shoreline itself, and the smell stayed with them.
For months.
Probably forever. As we drift further through this frozen sea, there's something to be said about Viking psychology. We often think of them as brutal or fearless, but endurance requires a different kind of courage.
Not rage or glory, just quiet acceptance. Imagine rowing through mist that doesn't lift for days.
You don't see the sun or land or anything except the same grey sheet of sea. You eat cold fish.
You sleep half wet.
You wake up stiff. And yet you keep going. The sagas rarely praise men for killing. They praise them for enduring, for not complaining, for doing the miserable thing because it needed to be done. And that's what these voyages were. A ritual of endurance. Some scholars believe that's why the Vikings saw the world as a wheel. Yggdrasil, the great tree of existence, because everything turned over and over, winter into spring, day into night,
life into death.
The voyage was never truly over. You'd return home, only to leave again. A quiet rhythm, like the sea. It's strange to think that even on those long, icy journeys they sang, not loud songs, low ones.
Chants that sounded like the sea itself, slow, measured, repeating.
Some were for rowing, others were just for comfort. A verse from one old rowing song roughly translates to, "The oar knows no master but the wind. The sea knows no friend but the brave." Simple words, but heavy, and when the cold grew unbearable, when fingers went numb and the wind cut through their wool, they would pray not to one god but several, one for strength, one for guidance, one for calm seas,
Odin for wisdom,
Njord for safe harbours, Freyr for warmth, a small private ritual whispered into the dark. Sometimes it's easy to forget that for all their violence on land, at sea they were at the mercy of everything: wind, water, weather, and time. There's something oddly human about that. No matter how fierce you are, the sea always wins. Let's drift a little further into the faintest light of dawn. The mist begins to rise and you can just make out the shape of a coastline, maybe Iceland, maybe nothing at all. The men wake up one by one. Someone grumbles. Someone else checks the ropes.
There's frost on the sail and the sea has gone quiet.
The kind of quiet that feels too still, too watchful. That's how it was for them. A long night, a cold dawn, and another day of rowing into grey, because warmth, for them, was never a given. It was something they carried inside, and maybe
that's how they survived. Hey everyone! Still here? Still awake? That's fine.
Let's drift quietly onward, out of the cold sea and into something a little warmer. Not physically warm, of course. The Vikings rarely got that luxury.
I mean spiritually warm. See, when you live in a world where the wind can kill you and the ocean decides your fate, you start to look for warmth in stranger places.
The Norse didn't build grand cathedrals. They didn't have cozy monasteries or endless psalms echoing through candlelight. Their religion wasn't built for comfort. It was built for endurance. To them, even the gods were cold. But that didn't make them cruel. It made them familiar. Odin, for instance, the All-Father, wasn't the kind of deity you prayed to for protection. He was the god of wisdom and war, yes, but mostly of sacrifice. The kind of being who hung himself from the world tree for 9 days just to gain knowledge, which to a Viking mind made perfect sense. You don't get warmth without frostbite. You don't get wisdom without pain. So when men went to sea, they didn't ask Odin to make it easy. They asked him to make them strong enough to survive it. They carried small charms carved from bone or driftwood. Sometimes they bore runes, simple marks of power. One popular one was algaes, shaped like a trident. It stood for protection, divine shelter. The men might rub it before sleep, whispering a line from the Eddas, then close their eyes beneath a frozen sail. There's something deeply human about that, trying to summon warmth through belief when none exists in the air around you. And then there was Thaw. Not the polished comic book version, but the real one, the patron of every farmer, sailor, and common man who had to work with his hand. His hammer, Mjolnir, wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of stability. When the world felt chaotic, and it usually did, the hammer reminded them that someone, somewhere, was holding the line. Sailors would carve Thor's hammer on the mast, right near the prow, as a ward. They believed the hammer could calm storms, which naturally it didn't always do, but it gave them something to hold on to, a story bigger than the sea. Faith, after all, isn't about being right. It's about being able to row another hour when you're half frozen and haven't seen land in 6 days. And that's what the Viking gods gave them. Not comfort, but endurance. It's worth remembering that their idea of heaven, Valhalla, wasn't exactly a place of rest. It was more like an eternal training ground. The warriors would fight all day, die, be revived, and then feast all night. To a modern person, that sounds exhausting, but to a Viking it sounded perfect. They didn't want to escape struggle, they wanted to master it. Even the way they saw death was practical. If you died well, your story mattered. If you died poorly, you were forgotten. That was their version of warmth, memory. To be remembered by your clan, by your descendants, by the sagas. That was their immortality. And while all this sounds grand, most Viking faith happened quietly. No priests on a ship, no choirs, just whispered prayers and muttered runes. Before setting sail, crews often performed a simple ritual. The blood of an animal, usually a goat or a pig, was sprinkled over the deck. Not out of cruelty, but symbolism.
Life for life.
Warm blood spilled to remind the sea that they too were part of the same cycle. They called it blot. A blessing through offering, and the smell of that ceremony, salt, iron and smoke, would mingle with tar and pine until it clung to the ship for the whole voyage. It wasn't superstition, it was insurance, but beneath those rough beliefs ran something gentler, a kind of quiet respect for nature that bordered on affection. To the Norse, everything had spirit. Mountains, rivers, the wind, the sea, even the frost itself. They called them landvættir, land wights, guardian spirits. These were the unseen watchers of the world. You didn't worship them, you acknowledged them, like good neighbors. When approaching a new shore, sailors would sometimes remove the carved dragon heads from their ship prows so as not to frighten the local spirit. It was their way of saying, "We come in peace," a gesture of respect carved in silence. That's what faith looked like in the north, less about sermons, more about awareness, and it went both ways. If the land was angry, if storms rose or crops failed, it meant you disrespected the balance. You hadn't honored the world that fed you.
So you'd make amends.
Leave offerings, pour ale into the soil, whisper to the waves. There's a kind of quiet tenderness in that. An understanding that survival was a partnership, not a conquest. Let's drift now to the deeper heart of it, the Viking sense of fate. They called it weird, a word older than the sagas, older than the gods. It meant what must be. Not destiny in a heroic sense, but the idea that everything, good, bad, or baffling, was woven into a larger tapestry. You couldn't fight wired. You could only play your part well, and when you think about that in the context of the sea, it fits perfectly. You can't command the ocean. You can only navigate it as best you can. That's why, even when voyages went wrong, there was little panic, just acceptance. You do what you can, you row. You adjust the sail.
You whisper to the gods.
And if the waves still win, well, they were always going to. There's a strange peace in that thought. It's the same peace that kept them calm through blizzards, raids, and exile. If it was meant to happen, it would. So why rage against it? Better to row quietly into your fate than to scream against the wind. That's the warmth the Vikings carried. Not in their hands, but in their minds.
A steady fire of acceptance, because in the end, that's all you can really do.
Keep rowing.
Keep believing.
Keep the inner flame alive while the world outside freezes over. So as their ships cut through dark seas and frozen winds, the Vikings weren't just fighting nature, they were in conversation with it. Every wave, every gust, every glimmer of dawn meant something. They saw the divine not above them, but all around. It's easy to imagine them now, wrapped in furs, staring into the grey sky, quietly murmuring a verse to Odin or Thaw, or maybe to no one in particular. Just words released into the wind like warm breath into the cold. Faith wasn't about gods watching over them. It was about keeping the frost from reaching the heart. Let's drift one last time further inland, where their warmth truly lived. Not on ships, but in the longhouses that awaited them. The homes where fires burned low and stories replaced sleep. Next time, we'll step inside one of those halls and see how the Vikings kept their hearts warm when the sea no longer called.
Hey everyone, still here? Still awake?
Good, let's drift inland tonight, away from the freezing ships and salt-crusted oars into something a little softer, something that smells of smoke, wool, and damp wood. The Viking longhouse, not a palace, not even a comfortable home, really. But to a Norseman or woman, it was everything. It was warmth, community, shelter, safety, and noise. And yet somehow it was also calm. The kind of calm that comes from routine. From surviving another night of wind, snow, and complete darkness. Picture it. You step inside from the cold, your boots stiff with frost, your beard dusted white. The door doesn't swing open, it lifts open low and heavy, made of rough planks.
Inside, the air hits you first.
Thick with the scent of smoke and animals. A little sour from old straw. A little sweet from last night's ale.
Warm though, blessedly warm. At the centre, a long fire burns in a narrow trench running the length of the hall. No chimney, just a hole in the roof that lets the smoke escape.
Slowly, the air is dim, filled with ribbons of grey. Everything glows orange and red, the walls, the beams, the faces, and above it all that slow crackle. Fire, the only luxury they truly depended on. There are no windows, not because they couldn't build them, but because they didn't need them. The winters were too dark, the winds too cruel.
A hole in the wall meant drafts, and drafts meant death.
So the outside world stayed outside. Along the sides of the longhouse, benches lined the walls, broad wooden planks covered in furs and rough-woven blankets. These are beds by night, seats by day. Families sleep side by side here, wrapped in layers of wool, pressed close like spoons in a drawer. Children in the middle, elders near the fire. Privacy didn't exist. Comfort barely did. But warmth was shared. Even the animals slept inside. Cows, goats, sometimes sheep, separated by a low partition of boards. Their breath added to the heat, their presence to the noise. Imagine the sound, snoring men, bleating goats, the hiss of fire, and somewhere in the corner, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of someone carving bone into a comb. That was winter life. A season-long twilight between waking and sleeping. They rose with the dim light, tended to chores, cooked, mended, told stories, and slept again when the fire dimmed.
Not much happened, but that was the point.
Winter wasn't for adventure. It was for endurance. You might think that would drive people mad. And maybe sometimes it did. But the Norse were experts at patience. They filled the silence with sound, songs, sagas, stories. Every longhouse had a skald, or at least someone who fancied themselves one. A poet, storyteller, historian, and entertainer all in one. After dinner, when the fire burned low and everyone huddled beneath furs, the skald would begin to speak. The stories weren't meant to thrill, they were meant to soothe. Slow rhythm of words, the deep hum of voice. Sometimes it was mythology, tales of Odin's wandering, Thor's foolishness, Loki's treachery. Sometimes it was family history. Who fought whom? Who married whom? Who took which farm in the valley and why? The line between myth and truth didn't matter much. Both gave warmth and they listened.
Even the children.
Especially the children. Because in a world where the sun disappeared for months, stories were the light. Now, about those meals. You might imagine roasted meat and overflowing mugs of mead, but that's mostly the poets talking. The average longhouse meal was practical. Breakfast was usually porridge, barley or oats, cooked over the same fire that warmed the hall. Thick, grey, sometimes flavoured with dried berries or honey if you were lucky. Lunch, if it existed, was bread. Hard, flat, dense. The kind that could survive weeks in a storage pit. Dinner was stew, always stew. A pot that never really emptied, just simmered endlessly day after day. Meat went in when available, vegetables when not. Sometimes fish, sometimes roots, sometimes nothing but cabbage and barley water. They called it ever stew. It was humble, but it worked. For flavour, they used herbs, dill, onion, garlic, mustard seed. Salt was precious, imported or harvested from boiling seawater. Butter and cheese were luxuries for special nights.
Mead and ale were common enough, but weak.
Think of it as liquid bread, just enough alcohol to keep it from spoiling. And every so often, there was a feast, a real one, maybe to celebrate Yule, the deep winter festival, or a chieftain's victory, or the safe return of a voyage. Then the longhouse came alive.
Smoke thickened, voices rose, laughter filled the dark.
Meat roasted on spits, horns of mead passed hand to hand. There was singing, drumming, boasting, and the occasional friendly wrestling match in the corner. But even then, there was an undertone of calm.
A slow rhythm beneath the noise.
Vikings didn't party like modern people. They celebrated like survivors. Every feast was a small rebellion against the cold. They decorated the hall too in their own way. The walls were carved with knotwork patterns, snakes and branches, endless loops symbolizing the world tree, Yggdrasil. Some carved runes of luck or fertility. Others painted shields, polished to a dull glow by the firelight. Above the beams, bundles of dried herbs hung upside down. Thyme, sage, yarrow, both for cooking and for warding off illness, and illness did come. The longhouse, for all its warmth, was also a trap. The smoke made eyes sting, lungs ache. The air was thick, unchanging. When sickness spread, it spread fast. The Vikings didn't have medicine as we know it, but they had instinct.
Honey for wounds,
Birch bark for pain,
onion and garlic for infection.
warm beer mixed with herbs for fever. Primitive but not useless, and faith filled the gaps. If someone died, and they often did, the body might be laid outside on a bier of wood, covered in furs, waiting for burial when the ground thawed. Death, like everything else, was folded quietly into life. Still, there were ways to lift the mood. Games, for instance. Simple ones, board games like Nefertafel, a strategic game resembling chess, but older.
One side defends the king, the other tries to capture him.
The board carved from bone or wood, the pieces small enough to fit in a pouch. A good game could last all night, the fire crackling beside it, the players murmuring in concentration. Children played too, with little carved animals, wooden swords, balls of rags, the sounds of laughter echoing against the smoke-dark ceiling. A reminder that even in an age of raiding and survival, childhood still found a way. And then, of course, there was love. Marriage in Viking society was practical, but affection wasn't rare. In the long dark of winter, people paired off naturally. Huddled under shared blankets, warmth led to closeness, and closeness led to comfort. Love letters weren't written, but feelings were carved, sometimes literally, into wood or bone. There's a runic inscription from a comb found in Norway. It reads, "I love the one who owns this." Simple. Tender. So when we imagine Viking life, it's easy to picture only axes and raids. But here, inside the longhouse, there's something gentler. A world of shared breath, whispered stories, slow work, and quiet endurance. And it wasn't only humans inside. The gods had their places too. Small idols, carved from driftwood or bone, sat on a shelf near the hearth. Thor's hammer, Freya's boar,
Odin's ravens.
each represented a force of nature, a balance of life. Offerings, small bits of bread, drops of ale, were left beside them, not out of fear, but gratitude. The hearth was sacred. Every fire was a connection to the divine flame that kept the world alive.
Extinguishing it carelessly was bad luck.
Starting it was a ritual, and at night, when the fire dimmed to embers, someone would stay awake to guard it,
Usually an elder.
sitting quietly, wrapped in furs, poking the coals now and then.
Making sure the world didn't go dark. There's something hauntingly beautiful about that image.
A single ember, a single person, keeping the light alive through a winter night that might last 18 hours. You can almost hear the silence between crackles, the breathing of sleepers, the faint moan of wind against the thatch. That's the sound of the Viking world. Not war, not shouting, not horns, just endurance, a quiet pulse beneath the ice. They say that in old Icelandic tradition, when a child was born during winter, the mother would whisper the first story they ever heard. Not about love or fate or gods, but about fire, about how it came to be and how to keep it alive. Because without fire, nothing else mattered. And in a way, that's what all of this was about. Fire wasn't just heat, it was memory. The fire in the hearth mirrored the fire in the heart. You kept both alive no matter what the wind outside said. That's what made the Vikings remarkable. Not their conquests, not their ships, but their calm refusal to freeze. Their longhouses weren't homes in the modern sense, they were cocoons. Warm, smoky cocoons where humanity hibernated, waiting for spring. And when spring came, they emerged blinking into the sunlight, ready once again to farm, to trade, to sail, to fight, but always to return.
Always to that same long, low house.
The one that smelled like smoke and wool and life. The sagas never praised comfort. They praised continuity. And maybe, in a way, that's what warmth truly is. The steady rhythm of being alive, one night after another. So the next time you imagine a Viking, don't picture him swinging an axe. Picture him here, sitting by a dim fire, half asleep, a child curled against his side, the wind moaning outside, and the faint crackle of the hearth keeping the night at bay. That's the real heartbeat of the North. And if you listen closely, if you slow your breathing and close your eyes, you can almost hear it. Sound of people who knew how to be still.
Hey everyone, still here, still awake?
That's fine. Let's drift a little further now, out of the smoke-filled longhouse and into the faint glimmer of dawn. The air is still cold, but there's a new sound outside, dripping. The sound of ice giving up. The slow, rhythmic drops of thawing snow sliding off the thatch roof. You can almost hear the land sigh, an exhale after months of holding its breath. This was spring in the Viking world, not a season of blossoms and gentle sunshine like we imagine now, but a slow, reluctant awakening. The earth didn't bloom.
It stirred.
The rivers cracked open, brown and swollen with meltwater. The skies lightened, but the wind stayed sharp, as if winter wasn't quite ready to let go. And inside the longhouses, life began to move again. People emerged blinking into the light. Children stumbled into the mud, faces pale from months indoors.
Men stretched stiff limbs and tested the strength of their oars and ploughs.
Women opened the storehouses to inspect what was left. Grain sacks nearly empty, dried fish thin as parchment, butter jars scraped clean. Survival had been achieved, but just barely. Spring meant work. The first task was always the same: repair. Everything that could break over winter had. Roof beams sagged, fences collapsed under snow, ships cracked from the freeze. So with the first sunlight came the sound of hammers, wooden mallets, iron nails, scraping tools, the long, measured rhythm of a people reassembling their world. And yet there was joy in it, quiet joy. They'd survived. Again. It's worth remembering that for all the harshness of Viking life, their relationship with nature wasn't just endurance, it was partnership. They didn't conquer the land, they listened to it. Spring wasn't a gift, it was a negotiation. You gave back what you'd taken. The first ploughing wasn't done in silence. It began with ritual, a small loaf of bread buried in the soil, a few drops of ale poured out before the plough touched ground, a thank you to the earth for waking up again. This act wasn't superstition, it was etiquette. You didn't demand from the land, you greeted it, then came the livestock. After a winter cooped inside the longhouse, they were led back into open pens, blinking and snorting in the weak sunlight.
Cows lowing.
Goats kicking their legs in stiff joy. The smell, awful, yes, but alive. The animals had survived too, and in a world where every breath was earned, that mattered. And as the land thawed, so did the people. Wool cloaks were beaten and washed, still smelling faintly of smoke. Hair was trimmed. Beards combed out with bone combs, the first thing they often did. Bathe? Yes, Vikings bathed. Quite often, actually. More than most Europeans of their time. They'd heat water over a fire, fill a wooden tub, and scrub themselves with soap made of animal fat and ash. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Cleanliness wasn't just vanity, it was ritual rebirth. You washed away the winter, the stillness, the sleep. And then, slowly, the year began again. Crops were planted, barley, rye, oats. Fishing boats went back to the fjords. Trade routes reopened, and messengers rode out across the thawed roads. Life, once again, became movement. But it wasn't all work. There was celebration too, because of course there was. The Vikings marked the changing of seasons with feasts and blots, rituals of offering and joy. The Dissablot, for instance, was held at the beginning of spring to honor the female spirits, protectors of family and fertility. It was both solemn and hopeful. People gathered, poured ale, sang, remembered their dead, and asked for good harvests. To them, spring wasn't just about survival, it was a promise, and promises in the north were sacred. You can imagine it, a small settlement gathered near the thawing shore.
Smoke rising from the rebuilt roofs.
The first green moss creeping across rocks.
A fire crackling as people laugh softly, passing around bowls of stew that actually taste of herbs again. Children running, dogs barking.
The world coming back to life, and beneath all that, relief. A kind of humble gratitude that comes from living close enough to the edge to see how easily it could have gone the other way. The sagas never say this out loud, but it's there between the lines. The Norse didn't pray for more, they prayed for enough.
Enough light, enough food, enough time.
Enough warmth to make it through another year. And that mindset shaped everything about them, their stories, their art, their humor. They didn't believe in eternal joy, they believed in brief warmth between storms. Maybe that's why their gods were so human. Even Odin, the All-Father, wasn't invincible. He feared Ragnarok. He knew his own end. The Norse gods didn't live above suffering, they shared it. The world, to them, was a cycle of endurance. Frost, thaw, frost again. But for now, in the spring light, there was peace. Trade ships began to gather at the ports again. The smell of tar returned to the air. The blacksmith reheated his forge, hammering out nails and spearheads. The sound of metal striking metal, a heartbeat of civilization returning after hibernation. In the evenings, fires burned outside instead of inside. People sat in small circles under a pale blue sky that lasted longer every day. The stars shifted, the constellations climbed higher, and birds began to return to the coasts. And maybe, just maybe, someone told a story about the long winter that had just passed. About the storms, the hunger, the cold, the endurance. Told it not with fear or sadness, but with pride, because to survive winter was to prove yourself alive. They'd laugh, shake their heads, sip their ale, and say something like, "It wasn't so bad this year." Even if it was, because to complain was to disrespect the gods, and more importantly, to tempt the next winter to be worse. So they laughed instead. That quiet, ironic laughter that seems to belong only to people who have already endured too much to be shaken by anything else. And they prepared again, because spring for them wasn't rest. It was the start of the next challenge. Fields to plant, nets to mend, roads to travel, raids to plan. The rhythm of their year wasn't linear, it was circular. Like the world tree Yggdrasil, everything returned eventually. So while we might think of Viking life as harsh or brutal, they didn't see it that way. To them it was natural. It was life as it was meant to be, fleeting, difficult, but always renewing. And that renewal was their true warmth. You can almost picture the scene at the end of a long spring day. The sun dipping low over the fjord, turning the water to molten gold. A woman stands outside her longhouse, arms folded, watching her children play in the mud. Her husband mends a fishing net nearby. Smoke drifts from the hearth. Somewhere a raven calls, nothing dramatic, just life, and that's the beauty of it. For all their reputation as raiders and conquerors, most Vikings spent their lives quietly like this, planting, repairing, fishing, telling stories, surviving. Their glory wasn't in war. It was in getting up every day and doing it again. And maybe, as night comes and the temperature drops again, they look to the horizon and feel that same familiar peace, knowing the world has turned once more, knowing the frost will come again, and they'll face it the same way they always have, together, with fire, with patience, with stories. Because in the end, that's what warmth really is, the memory of survival, carried from one winter to the next. And as the embers fade in the hearth, and the last light of spring slides behind the mountains, you can almost hear that same whisper that's echoed through 1,000 years of northern nights. Keep the fire alive. Hey everyone, still here? Still awake? That's fine. Let's drift onward, northward, upward, into a world where the sun barely sleeps. It's summer now in the lands of the Vikings. The season of impossible light. You'd think warmth would come rushing in, all golden and generous. It doesn't. The north isn't a place that forgives easily. But even here, when the sun climbs high and refuses to set, something miraculous happens. The world turns soft again. The days stretch endlessly. The night, if it arrives at all, lingers only as a blue shadow that never quite darkens. You could walk from one fjord to another without ever losing sight of the horizon. This was the time when everything, the land, the people, the sea, moved. Viking life depended on this narrow window. Those brief, precious months when you could sail, trade, raid, and harvest. The world that slept through winter and stirred through spring was now alive, and yet they didn't rush it. For all their reputation as fierce marauders, the Norse had a curious patience about them. They treated summer almost like a guest, something to be honored, indulged, but never taken for granted. It began with Midsummer, the Solstice, when the sun stood still. They believed that on this day the border between worlds grew thin. The land itself seemed to hum. The crops pushed higher. The rivers sparkled with silver light. And across the settlements fires were lit again, not for warmth this time, but for celebration. Bonfires bright against a sky that never fully darkened. People danced, awkwardly, slowly, often barefoot in the dew. They sang songs older than anyone remembered. Someone would play a lyre, another a bone flute, and the rhythm would drift softly over the hills. You could smell roasted meat, fresh bread, ale foaming over wooden mugs. For a people who spent half their lives shivering, Midsummer was an act of pure relief. It was also a ritual of protection. Fire kept away spirits, smoke pleased the gods, and so, in every flame, there was meaning. Fathers tossed herbs into the embers for luck. Mothers carried torches around the edges of their homes to guard against misfortune. Even livestock were led past the flames, because if the sun's fire blessed them, it meant they'd survive the next winter. Everything was cyclical. You could imagine standing there at the edge of a fjord, watching the midnight sun shimmer on the water, the light bouncing off the waves, the reflection so bright it almost hurts your eyes. No wind, just the quiet murmur of people gathered, laughing softly, holding on to this fragile warmth as long as they could, because everyone knew it wouldn't last. The Norse had a word for the years turning, It didn't mean year like we think of it, as something linear or progressive. It meant a loop, a circle. Every joy already held the shadow of its ending. Every feast was a quiet farewell to the light that would fade again, but they didn't mourn it, not yet. Summer was too short for sorrow, so they worked. The fields came alive with movement, barley waving in the sun, scythes glinting like mirrors. You'd see men and women side by side in the fields, something that always surprises people, but in the north, survival didn't leave room for rigid pride. Everyone worked, everyone mattered. Children chased insects between the rows, their laughter echoing. Dogs barked. The air smelled of grass, of salt, of life. And in the evenings there were gatherings, meals eaten outside, on long benches, mead passed hand to hand, bread dipped in butter, salted fish, berries, soft cheese. Someone would begin to tell a story, perhaps one of the old tales of Freya, the god of fertility and sunlight, who ruled over the summer's bounty. They might whisper how he once traded his magical sword for love, a terrible bargain really, but a very human one, because even gods in the Norse world couldn't have everything. Or maybe they'd tell stories of voyages, of ships setting out across bright seas, their hulls gleaming with tar, their sails pale as bone. Summer was sailing season after all. The Vikings were never meant to stay still. Once the snow melted, the world opened up. Boats slipped down into the water like silver fish. Crews gathered their oars, their tools, their luck. And just like that, the settlements emptied. Not everyone was raiding, despite the reputation. Many sailed for trade: amber, furs, walrus, ivory, and slaves went out. Silver, silk, and wine came back. The north was isolated, yes, but not disconnected. From the shores of Iceland to the markets of Baghdad, Norsemen and women followed the light wherever it went. You could almost imagine standing at the harbour as they left, the air salty, the sound of gulls circling overhead, families standing by the shore waving silently, the water glittering under a sun that seemed to promise safety, and behind it all, the knowledge that no promise was certain. But that too was part of the peace. They didn't expect guarantees. They expected the sea to be cruel and the world to be unpredictable. And somehow that acceptance made them calmer. The Norse didn't fear fate, they respected it. They believed every person had a weird, a thread of destiny woven long before birth. You couldn't cut it or change it. You could only walk it with courage or not. And so they sailed, the oars dipping in rhythm, the wind catching the sail, the world stretching infinitely before them. You can picture the crew at rest one night, somewhere near the Shetland Isles maybe, anchored in a quiet bay. The air still, the water glassy. The midnight sun hovering on the edge of the world, refusing to set. They'd lie back on the deck, staring at the sky that never darkened, talking softly, maybe even smiling, and one of them would say something like, "This is as close to Valhalla as we'll ever get," because in that endless light, life itself felt divine. Back home, the settlements thrived. Women ran the farms, quite literally. Viking society was one of the few in early Europe where women could own property, manage estates, and even divorce their husbands. They weren't passive caretakers. They were the backbone of the home, and in summer their work multiplied. Grain to dry, meat to cure, wool to spin, children to feed. The sunlight stretched the hours long enough to do it all. But still, they found time for joy. At night, after the chores were done, people would sit outside the Longhouses, weaving tales as the light slowly dimmed into a soft twilight that never quite became dark. They'd sing lullabies to the children, old songs about heroes, ghosts, and gods, some gentle, some grim, all familiar, and if you listened closely, you'd hear the sea answering back, waves lapping at the shore in slow, steady rhythm. The same rhythm that had carried them through winter storms and still carried them now. Because even in abundance, they remembered scarcity. They didn't waste, they didn't boast, they simply lived fully, quietly, gratefully. And that, more than anything, is what defined their world. It wasn't the raids or the battles or the burning monasteries that made the Viking Age remarkable. It was this harmony between hardship and wonder. This calm coexistence with the cruel and the beautiful. They built their lives on contradiction, fierce and gentle, violent and tender, practical and mystical. They knew that every light was temporary, but instead of despairing, they cherished it all the more. And so, every year, when the sun stood still, they'd light their fires, lift their cups, and celebrate not just the warmth, but the knowledge that it would end. Because to them, impermanence was the most sacred truth of all. You could almost see it now, a group of villagers gathered on a cliff overlooking the sea. The horizon endless. The fire crackling behind them. The light golden, unending. Someone begins a toast. The others join in, raising their cups, their faces glowing, not in triumph. Not in mourning, just in recognition. The world turns, the light fades, the fire endures, and with that summer drifts on, slowly, softly, toward its inevitable close. The first leaves will pale soon, the nights will grow darker, and somewhere in the distance, the whisper of winter will begin again. But not yet. For now there's still light, still laughter, still warmth, and maybe that's enough.
Hey everyone.
Still here? Still awake? That's fine. Let's keep drifting, slowly this time, as the light begins to soften. The world once drenched in gold is starting to dim. The air feels different, cooler, sharper. It's autumn in the north now. The brief bright pulse of summer is fading, and the Vikings are preparing for the long retreat back into darkness. You can almost smell it. The scent of wet earth and smoke, of grain drying in storehouses, of seaweed washed up along the shore. The skies turn paler, flatter, like old pewter. The wind shifts, whispering from the mountains instead of the sea. Everything is slowing down, but not resting. Not yet, because autumn to the Norse wasn't quiet. It was a race. A deliberate, anxious rush against time. The first frost could fall without warning. A single cold night could ruin a harvest, spoil a store, freeze a ship in place. So every day mattered. The fields buzzed with motion, sickles glinting, hands rough and quick. Sheaves of barley tied in neat bundles lifted high into carts. Oats, rye, and beans, all the essentials of survival gathered before the land froze again. Every settlement became an orchestra of work. Children husked grains. Women smoked fish and salted meat. Men repaired storage barrels, sealed with tar to keep out moisture. Hunters vanished into the forests with bows, hoping to bring back venison, elk, or whatever the gods might grant. The rhythm was relentless, but beneath it there was gratitude, because every sack filled, every rack of dried fish hung, every loaf baked meant one more chance to live through the coming cold. They called this time Haust, the harvest. It was more than a season. It was a ritual of balance, a final gift from the earth before everything turned still. And as they worked, they sang. Not loudly, not in joy exactly, but in that quiet, repetitive way that keeps you focused when the body's tired. Songs about ships, about the sea, about heroes who never came home. Even then, their music had an ache to it, a melancholy that matched the color of the sky, because they knew, once the sun slipped beyond the horizon for good, it would be months before it came back. So they took their time with the light. The last warm evenings were cherished. People would gather outside, just sitting, watching the horizon burn orange and gold. The sea, still calm, would mirror the sky perfectly, as though both were conspiring to hold on to beauty for a little longer. Somewhere, a dog barked. Someone laughed softly. The wind shifted through the grass. It was simple, but it was enough. And then came the great reckoning, winter nights. A 3-day festival marking the true end of the light. It was part harvest feast, part farewell ceremony to the sun. Families gathered around great fires. Tables sagged with food, whatever was fresh, whatever wouldn't last through the freeze. Stew thick with onions and meat, fresh bread, cheese, ale that had fermented just long enough. Everyone ate until they couldn't, but the celebration wasn't just about food, it was about fate. Winter nights was when they honored the Dizir, the female spirits who watched over the household, and the ancestors who lingered unseen. The line between the living and the dead grew thin. The air itself felt watchful. Offerings were made, bowls of food left out overnight,
Candles lit in windows.
whispers sent toward the dark, because, in the Viking mind, winter wasn't just weather. It was present, it crept, slowly like a spirit, testing the walls, the roofs, the hearts, and you had to acknowledge it, to respect it, before it arrived in full. You can imagine it now, a longhouse glowing from within, laughter spilling softly into the cold. Outside, the first snowflakes drift through the air, melting on the still warm thatch.
Inside, a storyteller rises. He's an old man, maybe.
His beard white, his hands trembling. He stands near the fire and begins to speak, not loudly, but steadily. He tells a tale about the end of light, about how the sun is a warrior fighting each day against the encroaching cold, about how the frost giants wait in silence, patient and endless. He pauses, lets the fire crackle. Then he smiles faintly and says, "But don't worry, the sun always returns. She just needs to rest." And the room hums with quiet agreement, because that's what they believed. The world was a cycle of deaths and rebirths. Even in darkness, something always endured. As autumn deepened, the settlements began to retreat inward again. Boats were pulled from the water, flipped and stored. Nets were coiled, dried and hung. Tools oiled and wrapped in cloth. The land itself seemed to sigh and go still. The air sharpened. The frost grew bold, creeping in from the edges of fields and roofs. Animals were brought close, cows, goats, sheep, all crowded together for warmth. And just like that, the sounds of summer vanished. No birds, no waves.
Only wind. The Vikings didn't fight it.
They accepted it, prepared for it. And maybe, on the last evening of autumn, they stood outside one last time, watching the horizon fade from gold to silver to black, feeling that final breath of warmth on their faces. Somewhere a child might have asked, "When will the sun come back?" And the answer would be something simple: after she dreams, because to them the sun wasn't gone, just sleeping, waiting to wake again when the time was right. That faith, that calm certainty, was what kept them steady. They didn't fear the dark because they'd already made peace with it. They had warmth stored in food, in memory, in each other. And as they sealed their longhouse doors and settled by the hearth for the first true cold night, they weren't mourning the light. They were carrying it inside, because the truth was, the Vikings didn't survive winter by fighting it. They survived it by remembering summer, by holding on to the glow that once was and trusting that it would be again. And in a world where nothing stayed the same, that trust was everything. So as the last leaves fell into the fjords and the mountains grew white again, they prepared to wait. The same cycle, the same stillness, the same fragile, faithful rhythm of life beneath the ice. And soon the snow would come, quiet, endless, and absolute. But that's a story for another night. For now, the fire is still warm, the air outside still soft. The world not yet asleep, but thinking about it. Maybe that's enough.
Hey everyone, still here, still awake.
That's fine. Let's slow everything down now. The year is almost over. The light has left the sky. The wind has turned cruel again. And we're back where it all began. Winter has returned to the Viking world. Outside, the land is white and endless. The fjords have frozen at the edges, sealing the boats in place. The mountains look like sleeping beasts, heavy under snow.
Every sound is muffled. Even the air feels thick, as though the world itself has gone quiet to think. And somewhere in that silence,
a thin wisp of smoke curls into the sky, one small sign of life in all that white. the Longhouse. Inside, the fire glows steady, the same hearth that burned through last winter, still holding the world together. You can almost hear it, the slow crackle, the sigh of logs shifting, the soft murmur of breath and wool and life. People are gathered close again, blankets drawn tight,
Hands wrapped around wooden cups.
The room smells of smoke and dried meat, and of something faintly sweet. Honey mead, perhaps, or porridge warming by the coals. Outside, the snow keeps falling. Inside, time itself feels slower. Winter, for the Vikings, was never about waiting.
It was about remembering. They called it Yule, a time when the world slept, but the stories woke for them.
Yule wasn't a single night of celebration. It was an entire season of fire, feast, and reflection. The old year died, the new one wasn't yet born, and for a few precious weeks the world existed between. You can imagine the atmosphere, dim and golden, quiet but alive. The Longhouse was lined with evergreen branches to remind everyone that not all things die. Tables groaned under the weight of stored food, smoked fish, salted pork, dried berries, and mead brewed months before. But more than the food, it was the togetherness that mattered. Families,
Neighbours, travellers, they all came inside.
there was no loneliness in the Viking winter. The cold was too vast for that. Instead, there was warmth born from shared endurance, and as the nights stretched endlessly, stories filled the gaps where sunlight used to be. Tales of gods and monsters, of heroes who wandered the 9 worlds, of spirits that crept through the dark if you forgot to leave out an offering. The fire flickered on faces as words turned to pictures, and pictures turned to memory. Someone might tell of Odin's ride through the winter sky, the wild hunt, a ghostly procession of spirits sweeping across the heavens. You could hear the horses, they said, if the wind howled long enough, and if you saw them you should hide your face. Others whispered of trolls that roamed the forests after dusk, and of the Nisse, the small, grumpy house spirits who guarded every home, provided you kept them fed with porridge and butter. The young would listen wide-eyed, the old would smile knowingly. The stories weren't about fear, they were about belonging, a reminder that the dark was never empty, it was just different. Even the gods seemed closer in winter. Odin's ravens were said to fly low, searching for offerings. Thor's hammer rumbled faintly in the thunder of avalanches. Freya slept beneath the earth, dreaming the crops back into being. The Norse didn't pray for salvation. They prayed for balance, for the world to turn as it always had. And while the gods slumbered, so did the people. Not all day, of course, but life slowed to a rhythm that matched the silence outside. They slept longer, ate less, worked only when needed. It was a strange kind of peace, a surrender to the inevitability of stillness. But in that stillness, there was creativity. Winter was the season of craft. The men carved wood, handles, combs, beads, and sometimes intricate runes to hang by the hearth. The women spun wool, dyed cloth, wove patterns that told stories of their lineage and faith. Children helped where they could, or simply sat by the fire, listening. In those quiet hours, you can almost feel the heartbeat of a world refusing to fade, because that's what the fire was, defiance wrapped in calm. A promise that life, even surrounded by death, could still endure. Sometimes a song would rise,
low and slow.
the kind that doesn't fill the room so much as blend into it. Songs of ships long gone, of lovers waiting, of the sun returning, and perhaps, as the snow thickened outside, someone would pour a little mead onto the floor for the ancestors. Because in Viking thought, the dead were never far away. They didn't haunt, they shared. Every firelight, every shadow was a conversation between what was and what remained. So Yule became more than a feast. It became a bridge. Between people, between seasons, between worlds. And as the days passed, the first signs of change began to appear. A faint light in the southern sky. A day that lasted a few moments longer. The sun, hesitant, shy, returning from its rest. The Norse didn't greet it with shouts or triumph. They simply nodded to it as if to say, "We knew you'd come back." They trusted the world's rhythm too deeply to doubt it. And that trust, that quiet faith in the return of light, may be the most beautiful thing about them. Because when you think of the Vikings, you imagine storms and steel raids and ruin. But those were only moments. Their true strength was here, in the silence, in the waiting, in the steady patience of a people who knew that even the coldest night ends eventually. You can picture it now. A late winter morning, the snow still thick, but glistening now with a strange golden hue, the air crisp, the smoke from the longhouse rising straight into a sky so clear it feels almost sacred. Inside, someone stirs the fire. Someone else opens the door to let in a sliver of sun. It's weak, but real. A child giggles. A woman hums. A man stretches, smiles, and says, "It's turning." And just like that, everything shifts. Not suddenly.
Not dramatically.
Just enough to remind everyone that the world is alive again. The ice will break old soon. The rivers will move. The boats will go back to sea. The circle will begin once more, and the Vikings, for all their endurance, never saw that as routine. It was always miracle. Every sunrise after winter was proof that the gods had kept their promise, that the fire had done its job, that life had waited long enough to continue. You can almost hear it, the gentle scrape of chairs, the soft sound of laughter, the fire crackling a little higher as someone adds a fresh log. 1,000 winters, 1,000 fires, all carrying that same quiet truth. Warmth isn't the absence of cold, it's the choice to share light in spite of it, and so the long sleep ends. The cycle completes itself. The hearth keeps burning. The people begin again, because in the Viking heart, winter was never the enemy.
It was the teacher, and what it taught year after year
Was simple: hold the flame, trust the turning, and never, ever forget the warmth you made yourself. The fire fades, the embers glow, and the snow outside softens into silence. That's the end of our long northern year, one of cold seas, stubborn light, and quiet strength. If you're still awake, thank you for drifting through it with me. And if you're already asleep, that's fine. You're where the Vikings wanted to be this time of year, safe, warm, and surrounded by stories.
Hey everyone.
Tonight we're drifting back to the North Sea. The waves are black and heavy, the stars above are sharp as frost, and the sound you hear is the slow creak of a long ship cutting through ice-laced waters. Pause. The men aboard are shivering. Their cloaks are damp, their beards are crusted with salt, and someone, inevitably, has frostbite somewhere unpleasant. And yet, for all the cold, there's no fire.
No roaring hearth.
No flicker of warmth beneath a sail, just breath, wool and hope. So how did the Vikings, those famously practical, occasionally murderous, and always freezing people, keep themselves warm while sailing across the kind of sea that would kill most of us in 10 minutes? That's what we're exploring tonight. So settle in, pull your blanket a little closer,
And let's drift back to the Viking Age.
where warmth was a luxury and central heating meant being crammed next to 12 other people who hadn't bathed in a month. If you were a Viking, setting sail around the year 900, you'd be living in what historians like to call a challenging climate, which is academic for it was cold enough to make your soul hurt. The North Atlantic could freeze solid in places. The wind would cut through you like you'd personally offended it.
And your longship, beautiful though it was, offered no protection at all. It was essentially a big wooden canoe with dragon decorations.
No deck, no cabin, and absolutely no place to light a fire. The Vikings, being Vikings, of course, tried anyway. They experimented with small fires in iron pots called heating pans. These were suspended over stones or set into sand at the ship's bottom. And yes, occasionally this worked. More often it didn't, because naturally fire and wood and fabric sails make terrible companions. A few too many embers, and suddenly your journey to plunder Ireland became a journey to the bottom of the sea. So instead, the Vikings turned to the human body's most reliable furnace, itself. The trick, they discovered, was layers. Wool, linen, animal hides, anything that trapped air and held moisture away from skin. A well-dressed Viking sailor looked less like a warrior and more like a particularly resentful onion. They'd wear thick woolen tunics, trousers bound tight at the calves, fur-lined boots, and cloaks fastened with bronze or iron brooches. Their ships carried cloaks made of sheepskin, sometimes even lined with fleece turned inward. The wealthy might wear reindeer hide or seal fur if they'd recently murdered a seal for it, which was likely. But the real warmth came not from fur or wool, but from proximity. A crew of 30 or 40 men, packed shoulder to shoulder beneath a sail, all exhaling warm air into the cramped space. That was insulation.
That was life-saving.
And it explains why Viking crews were known to sleep so close that they practically fused into one snoring collective organism. It wasn't pleasant, it was just necessary. Some ships even had low, tent-like coverings stretched over the midsection, called tilts or awnings. They were made from sailcloth, oiled leather or woolen tarpaulins tied down with ropes. These offered just enough protection from the rain and wind to keep the crew alive. The air beneath would grow thick, wet and rancid, but at least it was warm. Inside these makeshift tents, they'd huddle, sharing the heat from small oil lamps called lysi. These lamps burned seal or whale oil in shallow iron or clay bowls, giving off a faint yellow light and an even fainter warmth. They smelled terrible, like burning fish, but they were the closest thing to a fireplace the Vikings could manage without dying in a blaze of irony. Of course, before and after the voyage, Vikings preferred warmth in a more civilized form. The Longhouses, the longhouse. These long wooden halls were miracle machines of prehistoric insulation. Thick turf walls, thatched roofs,
Central hearths that burned all day.
inside heat rose and smoke drifted lazily through a vent in the roof. coating every rafter in soot. The floor was layered with rushes and animal skins, and benches ran along the walls for sleeping. It wasn't comfortable exactly. It was smoky, dark, and constantly damp. But compared to an open deck in the North Sea, it was paradise. And it was from these warm, communal halls that sailors set out reluctantly.
Into the frozen waves. The curious thing about the Vikings is how normal the cold was to them.
They didn't write about it much. They barely complained, at least not in surviving sagas. To them, the cold wasn't an enemy, it was just
there, like the sea.
Or the constant threat of dying violently. They had words for snow, frost, and ice, dozens of them, but they saved their real poetic energy for describing wind. Winds could bring good fortune or death. They were named, cursed, prayed to. Cold was just the background noise of existence. That stoicism probably explains why Viking-era Scandinavians rarely built ships with enclosed cabins, even for long voyages. Some later versions, like the Thaw, a wider cargo ship, had small shelters or removable huts, but they were the exception, not the rule. Most Viking sailors slept directly on their gear, coils of rope, animal hides, or their own shields, and relied on their cloaks and body heat to keep them alive. And they did survive. We know this because, inconveniently for everyone else, they kept showing up. On English coasts, in Irish monasteries, in French river towns, still alive, still cold, and still somehow not frozen to death. They even reached Greenland and North America, sailing through icy fog with nothing but wool and determination. When they made landfall, they built turf houses again, half buried, sealed tight, and heated with simple hearth fires. They adapted. Because, if the sagas tell us anything, Vikings were nothing if not stubborn. The question of warmth wasn't just physical, it was cultural. A good Viking man, according to their sagas, was expected to endure discomfort. Complaining was undignified.
Freezing stoically was a sign of strength.
There's an old Norse word, kulda, meaning coldness, not only in temperature, but in temperament. A man who could face the cold with calm was a man of worth, so they didn't whine. They wrapped themselves in animal skins, clenched their teeth, and rode through sleet, because that's what a proper Viking did. It's almost poetic, in a bleak, hypothermic kind of way. When they weren't sailing, the Vikings developed other ways to cheat the cold. They made heated stones, small, flat rocks warmed in a fire, wrapped in cloth, and tucked inside cloaks or beneath bedding. They filled leather pouches with hot water or animal fat to create primitive hot water bottles, and naturally they drank
mead, ale, or anything else that numbed the sensation of being slowly turned into an icicle. But on the ship, even alcohol had its limits.
Too much mead, and you'd fall overboard, which would end the warmth problem permanently. So most of the time, they simply endured. They rowed until their muscles burned, ate cold, dried fish, and counted down the days until they saw land again. Modern reconstructions of Viking voyages, done by brave, possibly unwise enthusiasts, have shown that it's almost impossible to stay dry on a longship. Sea spray seeps through everything. Even the best wool soaks eventually, and the temperature drops fast once the wind hits it. Researchers who've tried to replicate these journeys often describe the cold as numbing, total, and spiritually disorienting. One even said, "You stop thinking about warmth, you just become part of the ship." Which sounds poetic, but also deeply unpleasant. The Vikings had a word for that kind of merging: seder, a magical connection between humans and nature. Maybe, in a way, enduring the cold wasn't just survival, it was spiritual. A test of will and faith and stubbornness. Let's drift, for a moment, to a particular scene. The year is roughly 985. You're on a Nar, heading west from Iceland toward the edge of the known world. The sea is grey as slate. Snow flurries drift across the deck. The sail above you cracks like thunder in the wind. You're wrapped in a reindeer skin cloak, sitting beside a chest filled with dried fish, your hands numb and aching. You can see your crewmate's breath in the dim, pale light. Someone hums a low song, something about Odin, or home, or both. And beneath you, the ship's timbers groan like a living thing. It's miserable, but it's also strangely peaceful. This is what the Vikings lived for. The test, the endurance, the quiet, endless movement of the sea. And as long as they could feel their fingers, and sometimes, even when they couldn't, they kept going. Now, there's a charming myth that the Vikings used stones heated by volcanic activity to warm their ships. Sadly, there's no real evidence for that. Volcanic regions like Iceland certainly offered warmth from the earth, but carrying lava rocks onto a wooden ship wasn't exactly advisable. It's the kind of story medieval chroniclers loved, because it made the Vikings sound like frost-proof supermen. In reality, they were just cold men in wet clothes trying not to die. And yet they succeeded often enough that the myth persisted. There's something quietly admirable about it, really. They didn't invent insulation or stoves or fancy wool-lined boots with moisture barriers. They just used what they had, endured what they couldn't change, and made it work.
It's not glamorous. It's not even comfortable. But it's very
Viking, because in their world, survival itself was a kind of triumph. So the answer to our question, how did the Vikings heat their ships on icy seas without fire, is simple. They didn't. They outlasted the cold instead. They turned themselves into human furnaces through motion, companionship, and sheer defiance of nature. They wore wool, huddled close, and learned to treat frostbite as just another minor inconvenience. And when they finally reached shore, they built fire.